Good afternoon, everybody. This is a joint meeting of the West Turlock Subbasin GSA Technical Advisory Committee and the East Turlock Subbasin GSA Technical Advisory Committee. And I will call this meeting to order because I know we have a quorum, at least at the West Turlock GSA. Herb, are there any special instructions? It sounds like we only have Jesse and Wes Miller online right now.
The special instructions that I know of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Sarah, would you like to call your group to order?
Yes, so we can call our meeting to order. And we do have a quorum of all of our top members here.
Wonderful. Why don't we also do introductions, just so as we're all meeting in person again, just so we get to know each other a little bit better, although it's all familiar faces from what I can tell. Debbie, would you like to start?
Sure. Debbie Monteporto. I'm with the Turlock Irrigation District, and I also serve as the plan manager for the Turlock Subbasin GSP.
I am Leandro Maldonado. I am representing Delhi County Water District, and I am the general manager for the Delhi County Water District.
Richard Lindo with Denair CSD.
Herb Smart with Turlock Irrigation District.
Mike Pitcock, City of Waterford, representing Hickman.
Michael Clipper, West Turlock Treasurer and TID.
Miguel Alvarez, City of Modesto.
Lacey McBride, Merced County.
Sarah Wolf, Water District.
Mike Tietza, East Turlock Subbasin GSA Coordinator.
Dennis Yosuya, Belico Cortez, Water District.
I'm Christy McKenna, Stanislaus County.
Matt Beeman, Merced Irrigation District.
Michael Cook with Turlock Irrigation District.
Meredith Parkin with Environmental Science Associates. I'm giving a presentation today.
Jennifer Land with Turlock Irrigation District.
All right, so that brings us to item number 3, public participation. This is the time set aside for members of the public to directly address the technical advisory committees on any item of interest to the public that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the technical advisory committees. So if you'd like to speak now, you may, or wait till an item is on the agenda if you're speaking about the agenda item. So with that, I'll open public participation. Do you have anybody from the public who would like to speak? And I don't see any hands online either, so I'm assuming no one wants to speak at this time. But that will close public participation. Moving on to item number 5, meeting minutes. This is the approval of the March 21st, 2023 regular joint meeting of the West Turlock Technical Advisory Committee and the East Turlock Technical Advisory Committee. So those minutes were distributed earlier in the week. Do I have any motion for approval, any changes? Any thoughts on that from the West Turlock Technical Advisory Committee?
I'll motion to approve. I'll second.
Thank you, Richard and Leandro. Motion is second. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the minutes stand approved. Over to you, Sarah.
So we need to approve the same set of minutes for East Turlock. I get a first and second for that.
Make a motion.
Lacey, thank you.
I'll second.
Matt, thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, moving on to item number 5, budget update. Overview of revenues and expenditures for West Turlock and East Turlock Subbasin GSAs, and an informational update on the forecasted costs of the Turlock Subbasin for the July 1 through June 30th, 2024 budget year. So with that, Michael Clipper, we'll hand it over to you.
I'll hand it over to Debbie, or do you want?
You want to talk about like the status, and then we can talk about the preliminary budget for next.
Budget now.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, I'll start. So as you all know, we're planning or needing to plan for this upcoming fiscal year. And so we wanted to give everyone an idea of the projects that we were looking at, as well as the costs. I've been coordinating with Sarah and Mike Tietza with the East Turlock TAC and GSAs to talk about joint projects as well as the projects that each individual agency may be doing. And so this is an idea of what the West Turlock budget might look like over the next fiscal year. we'd be budgeting for the annual report. Water level analyses, I'd like to move to budgeting for that separately. And the reason for that is that, you know, we want to be looking at the water level data once it becomes available, doing the analysis and then understanding what that means as we manage the subbasin. So then that information would then fold into the annual report when we have to develop it. It would also make the annual reporting process a more streamlined process because we're not trying to do so much all at once, right? And so I'm pulling those numbers out of the annual report budget to enable that process, and we would contract for that separately. That would result in updates to the hydrographs and updates to the contour maps and all of that. And we'd have that information. We could talk about it at the TAC. We can talk about it at the GSA. We can evaluate what it means with respect to the minimum thresholds and all those types of things. And so it's more of a real-time analysis and management process. And I think that's probably where the subbasin needs to go as we move forward. So that's what that item is. And pursuant to that, we'll also be coming back to the tax and the GSAs for a recommendation to proceed with contracting to do that for the fall 2022 and the spring 2023 water level measurements in this coming month or so. So that's what that item is. We committed within the GSP to develop a drinking water mitigation program and plan. And so that's what that the $60,000 item is. There's an MT exceedance implementation funding. So, you know, if there's something that needs to be done with respect to that, we would have some funding to do that next fiscal year. We will be receiving responses from the Department of Water Resources by the end of this calendar year and within the next fiscal year regarding the GSP. So we need to plan for if there is a need to make revisions to the GSP in response to that. We need to have funding included to do that as well. There's a GRAT subscription charge. There's some funding to do another grant application if a grant application becomes available. There's a need to take a look at the minimum thresholds or MTs in the western portion of the subbasin, in the western principal aquifer, where the water level, the minimum thresholds and the measurable objectives are within a few feet of each other, just because water levels haven't changed historically significantly. And so when we established the minimum thresholds and the measurable objectives, the concept was that we would establish them based on the 2015 water levels or where they've been historically. And that tiny little band doesn't work well from an operational perspective, you know, and so there's a need to consider if there's opportunity to have a little more of a difference between the two and not have any potential undesirable results. And I think there is opportunity to do that. And we identified that as we developed the GSP, we recognized that. So we wanted to put some funding in there to move that forward so that we would have something in place to be able to have that analysis and the recommendations to make those modifications in place when we have the opportunity to do it. And there may be an opportunity if we do have to make revisions to the GSP to do it at that time, or we would have the ability to do it in when we update the GSP at the 5-year update, or, you know, that sort of thing. And so we'd have it kind of in place to address it whenever we need to address it. So that's, all
Sorry about that.
right.
But I have a feeling, did it stop? Excuse me 1 second, Debbie. Did it stop screen sharing again, Mike?
It was up there.
Yes, it's not screen sharing at the moment.
So then there's some dollars for some on-call services. If we need to contact the consultant team for something in particular, there needs to be the ability to do that. So there's some dollars in that. A little bit of money to do anything with respect to the website, if there's a need for that. Some inter-basin coordination funding, if there's a need for that. And then the last item on the jointly funded projects is a data management system with a joint portal. So that would be kind of developed jointly between the two GSAs as well, to provide water level information and those types of things. And that's something that needs to be scoped. But that gives us some dollars to do that. So the total combined of all of that is about $651,000, or when you calculate the split between East Turlock and West Turlock, it'd be about $330,000 for West Turlock's portion. And then there's some projects below for just West Turlock, and that would be some funding to install monitoring wells. We've had a few installments of that over the last few years, recognizing that there's a significant need on the west side of the subbasin to install monitoring wells that can monitor both the upper and the lower aquifer, as well as a need for monitoring wells along the rivers. We have applied for grant funding to do that work, but we don't know if that'll be funded or not. The hope is that it will. And so the funding that we've accumulated can then be used to pay the bills until you get reimbursed, because that's kind of the way the grant funding works. If not, we could use that funding to install some of the wells and then, accumulate some more and install some more later. So that's the idea of that. And then there's a need to fund the monitoring, the water level reporting. So uploading all the information into the Department of Water Resources portal and that sort of thing, and then providing presentations to the GSA as well. And so we have those items listed separately. So in total, it's about $590,000, which is a little more than last year, but not a huge amount. And then I think Michael has more on what all of that means as far as the individual agencies, but I'll stop. And if you guys have any questions.
Have you said a little bit more? What is a little bit more, like 10%, 20%, 5%?
It depends on who you are.
Okay,
20%, I would say,
about 20%,
up to about 20%.
up to, okay.
As a smaller agencies, you have more of your portion, more of your amount is based on dues, which didn't change. So
Okay.
then if you want to switch over, you can kind of see other illustration. And anyone, feel free to contact me if you have any specific questions about this, and I can show you all the math and the breakdown of our calculations.
Am I okay to hit okay?
Just X out of that. Okay.
I'm having a hard time today.
There we go.
Which tab?
That tab.
Okay,
Everything's right.
perfect. Thank you.
This kind of shows the individual member agencies for the West Turlock. And then the first column is last year's budget, where we collected last year. The second column are just the projects and your proportion on the projects. Next is basically the dues that would be due. And then the following one would be kind of total that we would collect from everyone. And then as you can kind of see, the percentages are the increases from last year to this year. So bigger agencies are about 22%, and those smaller agencies are about 6%. And then Modesto is the outlier because that's actually taking into consideration the credit that they had on the account. Anyone have any questions about that at this point in time?
Questions for Michael. Will you be sending out some of this preliminary information? I don't know where the agencies are with the budget. They've probably done preliminary budgets, I think, because we're in April. Like Mike Pitcock, how far along is like Waterford in your budget process?
Draft has been created.
Okay.
Budget some money, but I'm not seeing us up there, so I'm not sure. I think we're an affiliate, but I'm not sure about
Yeah.
actual member.
Good. What about like Leandro and Richard? Yeah, how are you? Where are you guys in your budget process right now?
Almost done.
Yeah.
Or it's, I believe they're almost done, but above my pay grade.
I hope this won't throw you in a tilt. Michael, if you want to send the numbers around maybe as quick as possible, just so people can have that, internalize it and go from there, that would be good.
And a couple of people did kind of ask early on what the numbers might be. I give them rough, about 20% increase.
Oh, so that's good then. Okay. Way to hedge.
But it was real rough numbers.
Okay. Anything about the projected budget for next year, either in terms of tasks or in terms of overall costs from anybody? You know, Debbie worked with Mike to kind of align what the West and East Turlock folks were working on, so that was good.
Yeah.
It's not an action item, just an informational item. So. Sarah, do you have a budget update?
No, I mean, I think it's covered in our presentation of our budget to our TAC is just a little bit different format. Gonna confuse it all, but our numbers are aligned with what you guys have on yours. And, you know, we obviously have some additional projects as well, but yeah, they're same boat.
I would just add that, you know, so we're going through a little bit more detailed analysis because we're gearing up for a fee assessment to be adopted. You know, we do have, you know, a shortfall relative to our existing fee assessment. And so we're crunching through the budget numbers now, and it's been very helpful to meet with WTS GSA and, you know, just identify the things that we want to do together as a sub-basin. And then we're focused on some, you know, some additional projects and management actions that we're adopting on the east side.
All right, sounds good. Any questions for Mike or Sarah? All right.
Michael, if I could say one more thing.
Yes, Debbie, go ahead.
So the other thing I just wanted to mention is that these numbers, although it does include funding for the well installations, and if we do get funding for that, then, you know, we could perhaps parlay some of that once it gets reimbursed into the rest of the grant that we applied for. But really, there is a little footnote down there saying that we haven't included all of the grant related costs in this budget simply because we don't know if we're going to get the grant or not. And so once we hear back, we can reassess. Likely by the time it gets contracted, we'll only have about a half a year, you know, and it takes a little while to ramp things up. And there will be some funding coming back from the existing grants once that gets wrapped up. So there may be opportunity to move some of that forward, or we may have to have a second look at the budget at that time and kind of figure out what their best approach is. But there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of unknowns about that grant. It was a large grant and there's a lot of project proponents. So some of those project proponents would be funding those individual projects and that would roll up into the grant. So how it all works just depends on what gets funded and what doesn't. And to try to presuppose all of that right now, it might be a little premature. So we didn't specifically include anything other than the well installations in the preliminary budget now. So I just want to make everyone aware of that. We may have to, kind of circle back and talk about that if we are successful in that grant application, which we hope we will be, but we'll do that at that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the larger the award, the more of a problem we'll have with cash flow and different things. So we get $20 million, we're gonna have definitely look at it. Whereas if we get $2 million, there's not gonna be as much of a problem.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just a kind of a complicated thing. Although some of the projects that we have included are projects that could be funded under the grant because if you recall, there were 4 different components. And the third component, it includes annual reporting, it includes the drinking water mitigation and some of those are domestic well mitigation and some of those projects that we have included here. And so there's a lot of nexus, but it's not a one-to-one comparison. And so we have to kind of think through all of that. Once we know what could be funded or is, awarded, then we can kind of work through all of that and come to and talk about timeline and cash flow and all of that and come to you with some recommendations on how best to proceed. Yeah.
All right, thanks for that, Debbie. So moving on to the main event, item number 6. This is a workshop to review and discuss the Appendix F, the project and management action specific checklist of the consolidated programmatic environmental impact report we did for GSP implementation. We have with us Meredith from ESA. So I'll hand over to you, Meredith.
Hello, everyone. I think many of you have heard in the last few months about the program environmental impact report that we did for the GSP. And what we wanted to do today is that the board has already certified the PEIR. I think it's through the 30 days. It's good to go as part of use, and we want to make sure that we send it. So what I wanted to do today was to walk you through one of the appendices of the PEIR specific checklist to make it faster and easier to actually implement projects. Sequence through, because not every single project is going to be exempt from the executive order, for example, the ground for flood mar. So we wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of this checklist and the use of it. So I don't think it depends on how interactive. Please ask as many questions as you want. There's some handouts that I'm going to go through up here if you want to physically, but I'll go through it up here. And we can walk through the checklist to make sure everybody's aware of what it can do. So again, just stating that funding for this project. Can I move this? Oops. Funding for this project is through Department of Water Resources.
Evidently, we're not
68
screen sharing again
Oh,
correctly.
okay.
If this helps.
You're fine.
Oh, it's on the.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good, but I think for some reason it keeps freezing on. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Is that better?
No,
No?
still stuck on the
First page.
enable editing screen.
I wonder if I do this first. Oh.
The screen on the left is was sharing.
Okay, that's good.
Any better?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you for that.
All righty. So here we go. We have funding through Prop 68. So the agenda is to do a brief overview, just to remind you what's in the PEIR. And then go through this project and management action specific checklist. It's kind of going through what are the next steps for CEQA for these specific projects within the GSP or outside the GSP if it's groundwater related. And then I want to go through one of the checklists. We have one filled out that we can just walk through, make sure everybody understands how to fill it out. Not that I'm expecting you all to do it. You may have sub-consultants, but I just want to make sure that you're aware of what can be done. And then left time for questions and answers or questions and discussion. So this is the entirety of the PEIR. The last appendice is this project and management action specific checklist, which we're hoping is what's going to be used in the future. All the rest of it will be referenced for this checklist. So just a reminder, you know, the PEIR followed along with the GSP as far as like concepts. What are these projects and management actions? The PEIR evaluated what are typical construction activities for these types of projects that would fall from the GSP and O&M activities. We looked at direct, indirect impact mechanisms. What are those general construction activities? What are example features like a regulating reservoir that would result from construction? What are they O&M? How many times would people go visit it? Those types of things for O&M activities. And it evaluated things at a program level. However, it was pretty detailed, and what we're hoping is that as you go forward and want to implement projects, you can directly use information from the PEIR for your site-specific projects. So the projects are defined in the GSP and PEIR as physically constructed structural features like construction injection wells, surface water diversions, promoting conjunctive use and reducing demand for groundwater. We had different categories. We had direct recharge and lieu recharge, and then there's a combination of the two. And then management actions, which are non-structural programs. And some of those examples are demand reduction strategies, pumping management framework, or domestic well mitigation. So all of these were covered, these project types were covered in the PEIR. I know this is a big spreadsheet. And you actually have it, if you have a hard copy, this is here for you. But what it has is starting on the left-hand side, it's essentially like, what is that mechanism? Those three different types of projects that I talked about, the direct groundwater recharge, the in lieu or combination, and then the management actions. And then we go into like the description. What are those types of projects? No, I can't. Oops. The other is the typical type of, there we go.
I'm so sorry.
As typical types of impact mechanisms, what are the impacts that you're going to find from those types of projects, whether it be construction or direct impacts? We have operational or indirect impacts. And those are kind of listed there under typical impact mechanism. In the general construction activities, what are the type of things that you're going to see through construction? Mobilization of equipment, preparation of borrow sites, things that you'll see with projects. And then what are some of those features that are going to result from construction? And those are those physical projects like wells, pump stations, pipelines, intakes, those types of things. You can see like regulating reservoirs, water storage tanks, etc. And then what are some example operations and maintenance? So this was trying to think through, like, if you had a project, what is the range of projects? What are the types of construction activities that we needed to cover? What are the resulting project infrastructure? And then what are some O&M activities? So this is a kind of an all-encompassing of what was covered in the PEIR. We developed the project, the PMA, what we're calling PMA, Project and Management Action Specific Checklist. And it's not a requirement of CEQA, but since this is a program environmental document, we wanted to make sure that it was able to utilize, because you didn't have to have a CEQA document for the GSP. But any project that is implemented as part of the GSP is going to have to go through some CEQA process. Now, there are some that are being suspended right now from the executive order, but not all of them are suspended. So you have to go through some type of CEQA process. And then again, we were talking about the types of PMAs are in chapter 2, the geographical scope is there. The environmental impacts are all of this is in the program environmental impact report. In the executive summary, there's this flow chart, and this is essentially the process that you need to do if you want to have a project coming from whether the GSP or another groundwater project. So you're gonna identify what that project is. And then you're gonna look and use what we're hoping is this project specific checklist to determine, are all my impacts covered? Do I need to do some sort of CEQA documentation? And so what this flow chart does is that if you go on the left-hand side here, you're looking at, okay, do I have a project where all the impacts are covered in the PEIR? If you do, and you're using this checklist, essentially you can either do a memo to file, or you can do what we call an addendum, which is just a simple document addending the PEIR. And it's very simple. It doesn't go out for public review. So the best in all worlds would be if you had a project that all the impacts are covered in this PEIR, then you could just essentially go to the construction. If you find that you have at least one new impact that's less than significant or less than significant with mitigation, you may need to do a supplemental CEQA document. But even if you have to do that, you can rely, a lot of the information you can rely on in the existing information, the PEIR is our hope. And then if you find that at least one new impact is potentially significant that was not already identified in this program environmental impact report. For example, we didn't find a significant unavoidable for a certain hydrology threshold. If you find that it is potentially significant unavoidable, you may have to do what we call a supplemental EIR. And what a supplemental EIR is that you are supplementing the PEIR to kind of add, to discuss all of that information that's not in it, but you're still relying heavily on the program environmental impact report. So those are the kind of documents that are usually tiered, either tiered off of or used in a CEQA world if you have a program environmental impact report. So then the lead agency can just either adopt the addendum, the neg deck, or certify the EIR. And then we also went through and did all these findings. We did a statement of overriding considerations. These are all things that you have to do with a CEQA document if you have an EIR that's already documented in the program document that you can rely on and not have to redo. So some of the main benefits of a program document is that covers most alternatives, cumulative. So there's some of these sections that we're hoping you wouldn't even have to address in your future documents for new projects that you want to construct. Is that making sense? Yes, okay. So what we wanted to do is in this packet, I don't know if you have it or not, but I'll put it on the screen. This is an excerpt from Appendix F, which is an appendix to the PEIR, and it's a checklist. So it's like if anybody knows the Appendix G checklist for CEQA, it's very similar to that, to where you kind of are guided through the process, like, okay, I have this project, what do I need to do? So I thought it would be nice just to walk through this a bit, just to give you kind of an example of what it may be. And we used a regulating reservoir as an example. We had actually just done one for TID. And if we would have had this document, we would have absolutely used this as a checklist, and it probably would have streamlined things about 50%, maybe even more. So you chose that as an example. And we just chose a few resource areas. As you may know, CEQA has a plethora of resource areas that you go through. And we chose 3 just to kind of go through. Okay, so I am going to switch out to, if it will let me. Right here. Okay, here's the checklist demo. See it?
We good,
Is
Mike?
that, are we good?
Your clearinghouse.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so this is that spreadsheet I was just talking through, and what I wanted to show is that we're using regulating reservoir as an example. On the left-hand side, we have that under in-loop groundwater recharge. The typical impact mechanisms that we've have highlighted here, essentially some of those impact mechanisms that you'd see from a regulating reservoir. Some of the general construction activities that would be known for doing a regulating reservoir. What is the actual feature? Again, the reservoir. And then what are some example operation and maintenance, which are, for example, conduct regular scheduled inspections and evaluation of future performance. So this is how you would use that for an individual project. Scrolling down. So this is where we're starting the actual spreadsheet or the actual appendix and checklist. What I did want to start here is anytime that you're going to have a new project that you're going to want to construct, you still need a project description. We still need some type of information to be able to evaluate and use the checklist. So here, not as much in the background of the project objectives as much because a lot of that is already discussed in the PEIR, but where is it located? What are some of the project components, elements? How big is it? How wide is it? How much is going to be, how much dirt is going to be moved? What are those type of construction activities that you're going to need for this reservoir? Are trees going to be removed? So they're just as you would normally do for a project description, you would go through and list out what are some of those elements. And here's just an example of like an outline of what you can use to describe what you would do. Because as you go forward, you're going to need to know some of those answers to these elements to be able to answer the questions in the checklist. So this is what the checklist actually looks like. And anything in red is something we filled out. Anything in black is already a part of the checklist. So we have an example here of the title, the reservoir project, who is the PMA proponent name, you would put your name, contact information, et cetera. This is all very easy to follow. And then you'd provide the description. And so what was above was kind of a layout of how you can describe. And here we just briefly said, this is to construct a regulating reservoir. Adjacent, here's where you do the study area. What is the purpose of it? And it's gravity fed, pump that flows from where, et cetera. This is where you'd put in some of those project specific details. What's nice is that we have all these different things from that spreadsheet that we just looked at. We have all these different types. And so all you have to do is just check, okay, it's an in-lieu recharge project. And then we have a list of construction activities. So it's making it easy, like, yes, we're going to have mobilization to be able to do that. Yes, we're going to have the preparation of staging areas. Yes, we're going to establish access and haul routes for this project, those types of things. You may even have preparation of borrow site. So it's a list of things that you can just fill out. You don't have to think of all these new things. You can just start putting a checklist. And then what are we actually looking from it? And here we checked regulating reservoir because that's what the project is. And then what are some of the operation and maintenance activities? Again, there's just a menu of different things that you can just check. And it makes it a lot easier. You're not having to think of all these things yourself, and these are already covered in the PPI. I guess I'll stop there. Are there any questions so far? Is this making sense? Okay. So you're going to do the regional setting and surrounding use, just very easily say, what is it zoned? What are some of these facilities on site, et cetera. So these are very particular to your project. And then what are some of the other agencies and whose approval is required? This is just making sure that you are aware, is a section 404 from the Army Corps going to be required, or is the, Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board going to be required, et cetera. This is where you kind of list out some of those other approvals that you may need to get. The one thing that you're going to have to do that we couldn't do at a project specific level was Native American consultation. During the PEIR process, we did AB 52. We sent letters to the tribes. We went through this process, but they are going to want some kind of notification for your own project. this is the one thing I would recommend that you do. Your project specific, everything else might fall within the PEIR. This might be the one step that you just need to notify those tribes. And we have a list of those tribes in the PEIR. So when you have this determination, this is kind of like summarizing the information below, but you're essentially saying, wow, we went through this whole process. We looked at the PEIR, we gathered information, we looked at our project, and we think it's entirely within the scope of this document. We don't need to do anything else other than take it to our board that it's an addendum or even just an adopt an NOD for the project itself. So this is where we're seeing is where it might streamline this process for you that you wouldn't normally have for just a project that you're going to do on your own without anything to rely on. If, for example, you're going to do a regulating reservoir on your own without relying on this document, you would have to go through the entire Appendix G. You wouldn't be able to use any information from that's already existing. You'd have to create it all. And what we're doing here is trying to make it simpler to be able to go through the CEQA. So then we get into like the evaluation of environmental impacts. This is just kind of a description of what needs to happen. You can read through that, but it's essentially, we're going to go through this really quickly on these 3 different resource areas. So in the checklist, you already have everything in black is already pre-filled out. So you already have what impacts were evaluated in the PEIR, what was the significance for construction, what was the significance determination for the constructed features and O&M, where is the impact discussed in the document? And so all you have to do is look at your project and say, okay, for ag, are we going to convert prime farmland to non-ag use? For example, yes. Then there's already mitigation created for you that you can use. And you would then determine, okay, using that existing mitigation, would it go to less than significant for my project? Like it, for example, we went ahead and said this potentially significant and unavoidable because there is a chance, for example, land fallowing, you may be converting ag to non-ag use, and maybe you can't find and mitigate for that. So we said, okay, let's go ahead and do a significant and unavoidable. So we had it covered in the document, but you might be able to find that you don't need to have it significant and unavoidable. For the series regulated reservoir, we worked with TID and TID's attorneys to say, this regulating reservoir is in prime farmland. We are converting it, but it's not to non-ag use because we're still using this water for agricultural purposes. So we made the case that it was directly connected to ag. So it didn't have to be mitigated and it wasn't actually conversion of ag. So for example, we can determine less than significant, even though the checklist has all the way up to potentially significant and unavoidable. You can make a lower determination if you need to and still be covered in the document. So here we're saying, would there be substantially more severe significant impact identified? And we're like, no, we're not. We've already identified that we may convert, but it's less than significant. So is the impact within the scope? Yes. So you would go through this process, and I know it looks like it takes some time, but it's a lot less time than it would if you're creating this from scratch. So you would do that for all the impacts and just go through that thought process. And many of them could be as quick as what we just went through, that thought process that we just went through. And so we determined, would the PMA result in other impacts to ag and forestry resources that are not evaluated? No. So we're completely now, this impact is completely within the PEIR. We have a little bit of a discussion. And the nice thing is what we did here is we just cut and pasted this from the PEIR. So part of the justification that you're making for your determination is already written. It's already in this document. You just need to cut and paste it and make sure that it does fit for your own project. But that's another benefit, is that you already have all this text developed for you as a justification. Are there any questions on that? No?
I have a couple of questions, but I don't want to derail the thought process.
It's up to you. I mean, I'm happy to answer anything.
So I'm just interested in seeing maybe a few more practical applications. And, so let's say that we have a theoretical project with that involves grading. Can you walk us through the parts of the checklist that look at the bio and cultural impacts and how those are handled? That's one question. I think that would be super helpful. Another question, let's talk specifically about cultural resources. You say that if I understood correctly, the only thing remaining is tribal notification, so you don't have to consult the SHPO or notify the Native American Heritage Commission?
So, no, we already have the letter from the Native American Heritage Commission for the entire area. I guess I do have a bio example here as well. The one thing that you are going to need to do is that we did not do surveys, whether it be bio or cultural. We did not do surveys as part of this, and I was going to get into that just a little bit.
Okay.
But you will still need to have someone go out and verify and do a record search for cultural to make sure for your project specific. Do you have any, what are the species? What are the habitat? Now, we went through and tried to evaluate any species and habitat that we could see and find within the subbasin. You could find something different that we did not see, but our hope is that you go and verify the information we already have in the document is correct.
Okay.
That's the goal. I would say for grading is almost a part of almost every single project, right? You always have grading. So we have that as a construction activity that's covered. And so that's covered in geology and soils, that's covered in hydrology, that's covered in all, when you are moving dirt, that a lot of those impacts are already covered within the different resource areas as part of just general construction.
So using this theoretical grading project again, you would send somebody out to do a pedestrian survey for cultural resources and a pedestrian survey for bio. And let's say that you find, okay, bio, it's highly disturbed. There's really no habitat, cultural resources. You find nothing. And if it's already covered, then you're already covered under the PEIR.
Correct.
If you find evidence of, like, let's say you have some scatters of, potential cultural resources, and your archaeologist says, well, you really ought to do something subsurface. At that point, you're off the PEIR, or?
No, we actually found cultural is potentially significant and unavoidable. So you could still come up, find something. We already have mitigation to address that. So you may still find something, but you could still rely on the PEIR. You want to discuss it particular to your project, but you can still rely on the mitigation that we have in the PEIR and even the evaluation, the impact evaluation for that.
All right.
So it's like a cut and paste.
So your mitigation spells out the path that you're obligated to follow.
Right.
That's acceptable to the regulatory agencies, such as, okay, you find this, you do subsurface work, you have recordation, you have, okay. All right, got it. And let's talk about the tribes for a second. Let's say you notify the tribes and the tribes come back and they say, well, we've decided that you really ought to do some subsurface work at this site just because we think this whole area is a potential area that we're concerned with. And that's not something that was brought up, PEIR. What are you obligated to do at that point?
So even in tribal cultural resources, we found it significant and unavoidable, potentially if you find yourself in that situation. So we have evaluated and have mitigation accordingly. It's up to the lead agency. When it comes to tribal consultation, there's so much flexibility. And the nice thing is that they were already asked to participate geographically for this. There's one tribe that responded and we had no more responses, right? So I think the notification process and the fact that we already have a document out there. Now, they could still say, we don't agree with your environmental document. We want you to do more. But what we've put as mitigation in the PEIR already is what we've already seen from tribes and their requirements, right? We want to be there while you're constructing to make sure you're not disturbing any, artifacts. You're not disturbing anything that we would consider of tribal significance. And so therefore, now if something's found at that point, we even have a process for that. So I think what it does is it's not saying that you're not gonna find anything, it's saying we have a plan if you do. Now, some of the lead agencies may say, we don't like that mitigation, we want to change it, so you would need to do a supplemental document just describing those changes,
All right.
which is a much more simple document.
So, if I'm understanding it correctly, what you're saying is that if you're covered under the PEIR, doesn't mean, okay, you're covered, you can go home. It means you have a pathway laid out. You don't have to figure out what the pathway is.
Right.
You follow the mitigation path that's in the document if it applies.
Yeah, so it's this checklist is trying to walk you through that so you don't have to really think through it all. You just need to answer the questions. You need to make sure that you're in compliance with the existing document that's already been certified by both GSAs, board. And then, and again, it's at the lead agency's discretion whether or not, but you at least have something that you can even cut and paste and say, yeah, that analysis for ag is totally applicable for this. So I'm just gonna, what this does is it provides a documentation that you've at least looked at it. You're not just saying, okay, my project fits. You're saying why. And then you can either put this memo to file, or you may have an addendum, which is, a very short process. And then at least the lead agency has comfort. Yeah, you've evaluated it from your projects that it fit within that PEIR. That makes sense. Those are great questions, Mike. I think that was very helpful. So going through, here's the biological. And say the first one, make it a little bigger so I can actually read it. Is, would it result in a substantial adverse effect through habitat modifications? We found that there may be some habitat modifications that we can't mitigate, right? There's just no mitigation. And so we did find that there was potentially significant and unavoidable. Oh, I'm sorry, we found that there was mitigation. But there are different, so you'll see impact bio 1 and impact bio 2. Each one of those has kind of all the mitigation listed out of what you would do if you did find habitat or a special status species as part of your project. So your answer, yes, does it apply? Okay, we're going to apply the mitigation measure. It's now less than significant with mitigation. Was it more substantially severe than what was in the PEIR? No, because we found that it was less than significant with mitigation. So is it within the scope? Yes. So now you've said, we know what the PEIR evaluated, we looked at our project, we compared it to that, and it completely falls within that coverage for that impact. And you do that for each one of these. Some of these you might find it's just not even, it's essentially not applicable or no impact. For example, we found that as part of the regulating reservoir that we worked on, it didn't need a section 404. So even though the document, the PEIR covered if you did need it, there was no impact for this regulating reservoir. So it's still within what the PEIR discussed because it's to a lesser degree. We discussed a potential impact. This particular project didn't have an impact. So yes, it's covered. And then that goes through every single one of the bio impacts that are in the CEQA checklist, and that's in the PEIR. So those are just a couple examples. We also have, it goes through hydrology, but it's the same thing. What are the impact threshold that we needed to discuss? And that was discussed in the PEIR, how that project specifically would compare, and then would it fall within it? And you can see in the red what we just simply pretty much cut and pasted from the PEIR as far as the justification. Like as described in the consolidated final PEIR, construction of directed in lieu implemented on fee could adversely affect. But essentially we're saying we found that the mitigation would, this mitigation measure would reduce it down to less significant. So any other questions? I can go through the hydro section too. It's very similar to what you've seen from the ag and the bio. Unless there's something particular, some
No.
example.
Just so the way you design this, you go through the table and then you also do the narrative too. Pretty
Right.
fun.
And the narrative is essentially what you can go look at the PIR and say, okay, let me just cut and paste that analysis. If you feel like it's appropriate, you can cut and paste the analysis and then put it in this document. And so your lead agency has all of this in one place for your project. So most PIRs don't have this. You have to create it on your own, but we really wanted this to be used. And so we're hoping that this checklist provides that additional step.
So Meredith, so you go through this checklist and then you circle back to the flow chart to see kind of how this falls within, you know, it's like if is it completely covered, or do you need to have some type of addendum, or is there, you know, and that, so that is that the process?
Yep, exactly. So if you find every single one of these, that you go through the checklist and every single one that says the impact within the scope of the PIR, then you'll find, you'll find that all the impacts are within the scope of the PEIR. You can write a memo to file or an addendum, whichever the lead agency would prefer. And then they just have to approve it and you're done. Now, if you find that, for example, you find that you are going to conflict with local policies or ordinances, you find your project's going to conflict and the mitigation isn't applicable and your impact now is above that, you will just need to address this one impact in your supplemental document. So if you're to the point where you're like, well, the addendum or memo file isn't going to exactly, I might need to do a mitigated neg deck. But your mitigated neg deck could be extremely focused on which of these impacts that you were outside of the PEIR. We evaluated a real broad swath of what you may find. So it's going to be probably really rare if you find something that's not. You may need to give a little more project specific details to defend why it falls within it. But it's going to be probably fairly rare that you'll find something that is completely, that you're going to require something that was significant and unavoidable that we just never said it was significant and unavoidable for these types of projects. But yeah, you would always go back to the flow chart.
Meredith, I have a quick question, and maybe I'm just slow on the uptake, but looking at the Impact Bio 5. So in your example, construction, it's less than significant with mitigation. But then you go over, does the impact apply to the PMA? Yes. But then it says list MMs applicable to the PMA.
That's for your that's for your, you might say, we're not going to conflict with any local policy. There's no impact at all.
Okay.
So we don't need that mitigation.
So what you're saying is that initially it's as a general thing, the impact is less than significant with mitigation, or it could be that. But in this specific case, there's no mitigation measures that apply and there's actually no impact.
Right.
Okay, got it.
So we're saying we're less than what was evaluated. So it was already evaluated to an extent greater than what we needed.
Okay.
And Meredith, so the GSP includes projects that could be implemented by the GSAs, or there could be projects that could be implemented by the individual agencies within the subbasin who are members of the GSAs, right? So there's project proponents. So this document could be made use of for any of those agencies that are implementing projects that fall within the purview of the GSP. Is that correct?
Completely correct. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't just tied only to the GSP, that it was, if you are doing projects that are quote unquote outside the GSP, but are groundwater related and the impacts fall within that, absolutely you can use this. Because we had a slew of responsible agencies that would be able to use this.
So it could be really beneficial for the GSAs as well as their member agencies as they're pursuing implementing projects that are related to groundwater management and that sort of thing. Yeah.
One thing I would mention is that I always look first. Somebody asked me about a groundwater project. Is there a categorical exemption that you still would want to look and see, like grading? You may have a grading that's less than what you would need to do. And so I would always look for a CADX first. It's still a pretty easy process, you know, probably easier than filling out this checklist, right? Or is the CEQA suspended for it? You know, a flood project, we've done quite a few of those. It's an easy process. You still have to defend it like you're defending now, and they have a form that you fill out. But just think, you know, there are different options. And if you have a project that is suspended, I would much rather use that suspension than I would this document because it's an easier process. So you just need to think through the options. There are several.
So, in terms of actions that require, us to review, you know, I guess if it's categorically exempt or there's some kind of other exemption that applies, then you don't have to look at the PEIR, you just document the categorical exemption.
Right.
What about your installing monitoring wells? On the face of it, it's for monitoring and environmental protection, so it should be categorically exempt. However, you know, if there's no discretion being exercised, then the question never comes up.
If it's ministerial, correct, that
Yeah.
CEQA doesn't apply to ministerial.
So if a GSA is trying to make a decision, you know, it's deliberating about whether or not to install monitoring wells or how to install monitoring wells, are we automatically needing to review that action under CEQA, or are we assuming that wells are ministerial?
I think that depends on your lead agencies, because I think different lead agencies take that differently.
Okay.
So I think some think it's ministerial and others do not.
Yeah.
So we did cover wells on here. So if you need to do that and you want to take a more conservative route, then you can use this and really fast, you know, go through this and be like, yeah, we're covered.
Okay.
And not have to rely on a CADX. This is more legally defensible than a CADX.
Okay.
Because it's an EIR. So the threshold for if someone was to sue, if you want yourself covered, use this. Then, you know, if you're doing kind of a sketchy CADX, I would recommend doing this. Because it's not, for our CADXs, you still have to defend them. You still have to say why you fall within the CADX, so it still takes work. This also takes work, but you know, even for a CADX, we usually do a biocultural survey to make sure you're not hitting something.
And the exemptions from CEQA under executive order or are those similar in terms of documentation requirements to like a statutory exemption for a restoration project?
No, I mean, it's similar where you're having to put all the information in one place. It's kind of a different form.
Okay.
They have a great example. DWR has a great example that you can just pull and use. We just submitted one the other day. It's a really fast process. As we're talking about like a hierarchy of things, if you really have something that falls within the CEQA suspension, I'd go for that. I'd go over that than an exemption because, I mean, it's suspended versus exempt. So that to me is a little more solid.
But maybe even a little bit more solid than going through the PEIR process.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I would choose that as much as I could, but not all projects fall within that exempt. You have to be very careful that what you're using is within that suspension and executive order.
Do you get word back from DWR that yes, you're within the suspension? So you basically get a little check.
Though, right? I mean, they're reading it, but you're pretty much saying that.
But do they respond? Because we've had them respond and say, no, use a categorical exemption or just not respond at all.
I had quite a few where they don't respond.
Yeah, we've had responses. But if
you have to follow up with them.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
they get lost.
But at least you have documentation that you have, you know, provided that information to them. And so it is surprising to me that they said to use an exemption. But it's a case by case, I'm sure, yeah. And how much you're defending it. Like we're trying to go into the nth degree of defending why it goes within, why it's flood mark, and how it fits within.
Mhm.
These have been for grant projects, so then you have to have the CEQA concurrence from DWR before you can start construction.
Yeah,
So
you
that's
do need
why
it.
it adds that wrinkle.
Yeah, yeah.
They tell you to do exemption.
So that's the reason you need to keep bothering them. So if you don't have that and you want to go, do this, right? If you want to have coverage and you don't feel like you're going to get it from them, go through this process. Because we still did surveys even for this suspension. We still went out ahead of bio and cultural person go out to make sure what we were doing was not going to impact some. So we can say that in our documentation. I mean, it takes a day, right?
If you're doing a very benign monitoring well, but it's near a river and there's nesting Swainson hawk, then
You
it's a
can-
different kettle of fish, right? I mean,
Yeah, and you can't mitigate your way into an exemption. So if you
Right.
have an exemption, you have to fit within the lines of the exemption. You can't say, I'm gonna do X, Y, Z, Q, P to fall within it. That's not allowed.
Yeah.
It has to fall within the
right? Because
document.
all exemptions have that caveat, like you can use these, however, if there's cultural.
There's exceptions to the exemptions.
Exactly, that's it,
Yeah.
exceptions to exemptions, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
All right. All right, Meredith. that's
Yeah,
very good.
and I'm happy to answer any other questions. If something comes up, I can share my information and I'd be happy to help.
Yeah, so programmatic environmental impact report is a very powerful tool. It's at our disposal and hopefully we're working on projects and quickly. And it's the kind of thing that we can use. I know it takes a little bit of work, but a little bit of effort, but it's the kind of thing if you spend an afternoon putting the checklist together and reporting it, it will really be very beneficial for any projects you do. So encourage everybody to get the maximal utility out of the programmatic EIR.
If one thing I would say is that if you're doing an addendum or memo to file, you don't have to release it to the public. If you are going through the supplemental mitigated neg deck or EIR, you do need to go through that 30-day public review process, 30 or 45-day public review process. So I'm hoping that it fits within and you don't have to do that, but it does, there is that extra step if you do need to do a supplement.
Good. All right, well, thanks for that, Meredith. And moving on to item number 7, Sigma related updates. We've got 4 bullet points here. Herb, you want to start us off? You have anything on the communication side?
Yeah, the one thing I could think of is just especially related to the budget planning process for the next fiscal year would be getting the website translated for I can't remember the low price, but based on how we don't have a ton of content on our website. So it's fitting along the lines of $200 to $300 annually. If you look to use that, I think that gives us up to 3 languages to translate the site into. And it's a plug and play thing that feeds in with the vendor we already use for our web vendor. So it's supposed to be pretty seamless. And so looking to utilize that in the next fiscal year. Or if we can find a way to do it even prior, we can find a way to do that too. But it's I think it was $250 to $290 annually for that. And so I think unless I'm forgetting anything else, that's the only real update on the communications front that we have outside of things that have been done, communicating everything that's recently happened. The PEIR or sending out mail, things like that, email notices, I should say. That's it.
Any questions for Herb? Water level monitoring, Debbie, is that you?
Yeah, I have a couple of things, so I'm just gonna run through them if that's okay. And it fits in the last 3 categories on the agenda. The first is just to remind everyone, I think you all saw the email, but we did submit the annual report for the GSP on March 29th. And so we were all in compliance with that. And the next thing we'll be doing is submitting the monitoring data. We've been collecting water level monitoring data both last week and this week. And so once we have it all compiled, we'll be submitting that to DWR and then coming back to you all for a contract to begin working on evaluating that and then bringing it back to the group once that's completed. So expect to see that next month, and then we'll move forward with developing that. And that ties in with the next item that I have, which is the minimum threshold exceedance plan that we're developing. We have a contract with Todd Groundwater to move that forward. That's a part of our implementation for the GSP. And it's taking a little longer than we had anticipated to develop the initial draft. And so once that's done, it'll come back to the ad hoc committee for review, and then we'll bring it to the TAC. But the thought is that around the time that we'll have analysis of the data, we can then use that to see how the minimum threshold exceedance plan is utilized, because we'll be comparing that to the data itself. And so the timing will work well for that. So that's the plan. And we hope to have a draft to the ad hoc committee in May, and then of the minimum threshold exceedance plan. And then we'll be making use of the evaluation of the water level data for that process. So more to come on that. And if anyone else is interested in participating in that ad hoc committee, please let me know the minimum threshold exceedance plan, and we'll add you to the list for when we begin to kind of work through that. And then again, we'll be bringing everything back to the TAC for review. I also wanted to let the group know that we are wrapping up the existing grant that we have. All of the work has to be completed under the grant by the end of this month. And we'll be also submitting a draft of the project report for the grant to the Department of Water Resources for their review. And then submitting our final invoices by the end of May, beginning of June, and wrapping all of that up. So we're kind of on the tail end of that, and hope to have that completed by sometime in early June, and then there will be some final disbursements of funds. If you recall, the grant is withholding 10% of the grant funds until the final project reports and invoices are completed and approved. And then DWR will issue the final checks back to the GSAs. And so at that point, we would be reimbursed that 10% of the total, which is not an insignificant amount that will then go back into the joint account. So there's that as well. So that's that. I also wanted to let the group know, and I can send I'll forward the notice to the tax through Jennifer. DWR just released some guidance on the domestic well mitigation program recommendations that we've been waiting for. We knew that it was coming, but they just released that yesterday. And so with that guidance, be developing a scope of work to develop a domestic well mitigation program for the subbasin, and bringing that scope of work to the tax for their consideration in the coming months. Because that is another item that is in the budget, as well as it's in the GSP that we would develop one. And so we need to do that. And so be looking for that, but I'll send around the link to where you could find the guidance document. So if there's an interest in taking a look at that, you'll have that as well. And then lastly, I had the USDA reached out to me a few months ago. They had an interest in doing some groundwater modeling and developing and testing some tools that they had available to see how it could be used to evaluate groundwater recharge and groundwater and surface water interaction and those types of things. And so they have an interest in modeling the Turlock Subbasin and developing a high definition groundwater model that might be useful in analyzing SEQA, or not SEQA, but Sigma issues. And so a joint conversation, I think Mike Pizza joined the conversation with the USDA staff as they were, talking about their interests and what they'd like to do. And so what my plan is to have them come in and talk to the group about what their interest is in analyzing the subbasin and developing the modeling tool. And I think there's a real opportunity here for the subbasin because it could provide a higher definition model that we could make use of moving forward. I think as we develop the GSP, I think we all recognize that the model that we have is very useful on a high level planning type of a basis, but there's some improvements that will need to be made to be able to utilize it for some of the other things that we may need to do in the future. And this may be an opportunity to move us in a direction that might be helpful, or at the very least, it would provide an additional tool that might be helpful. So the thought is to bring them in and have them give them a presentation on what they're looking at and what their interests are. They have a real interest in developing the tool further and then publishing and those types of things on how they're making use of the tool and how they're doing the modeling and its pros and cons and those types of things. So that's their interest. They're not asking for funding or anything like that. It's of a scientific interest, similar to the USGS or that sort of thing, do those types of things. So Mike, I don't know if you had any.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the conversation was encouraging. I think that there's no downside to it. And it's likely that we'll benefit in terms of increased understanding of the subbasin. I don't know that we'll get a usable tool out of it. We may or may not, but I think anything that advances our knowledge is something that we should support and encourage. And the kind of support and encouragement that they're looking for is, data information that we have. Making, they want to make sure that their understanding of the conditions is right. There was a certain amount of that during our call. So I think keeping that momentum and that relationship going is a positive outcome, I think.
Debbie, are they planning on using our current model as a basis? They're building one from scratch?
They would build one from scratch, but they would take whatever information is available. And so my thought is that first, I want them to come in and so people can understand what they're wanting to do and talking about and thinking about. And then if the group is amenable, we could work with the consultant team to make information that was developed through the GSP available to them, not the model itself, but the data, that was compiled and gathered may be helpful in their development process.
Are they planning on using ModFlow or
No, it's,
Different.
remember which one they're looking at a couple different.
Mod flow, but they mentioned Mike Shee, and so I think they're gonna start. It sounded to me, we need to hear more about their plans. It sounded to me like more of a long-term project
Yes.
for a postdoc and maybe several postdocs. And they were gonna start with mod flow. But they did mention that eventually they wanted to use something that can provide more resolution on surface groundwater interaction, like Mike Shee. That all sounded very interesting, and we'll wait and see what we get, but there's no downside, and I think it's encouraging that there's interest in this particular area and gaining more knowledge. I think we can only benefit from that.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, Debbie. Anything else?
No, that's it.
So I know, I did give groundwater level measurements last week. Karen, you sent spreadsheet earlier today. So with Turlock series, a few other places, right?
Say again?
Groundwater level monitoring, you did.
Yeah, I
Must-
that today.
Yeah, perfect. So is there anybody outstanding we need to chase up?
Well, and East Side is, you folks are working on it. This,
We finished our groundwater level measurement, had one site we weren't able to get to for safety reasons. There was actually a stream that we couldn't ford. And we got all of our sites surveyed, so the data is being processed this week, so.
perfect.
Yes.
And you'll be sending me an invoice?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Can I send you an invoice?
The surveying was actually funded under the grant, which was,
Which is
And contribute
thank you, Karen.
for it.
no problem. That's it. I didn't even leave the office.
My coworker did the measurement, said, and I hate to give generalities because it's always wrong, but basically groundwater levels are where they were this time last year. This is perceptive, which in some respects is a good thing because last summer we did pump a lot more than we normally do, and we did not have a lot of surface water. And so to see somewhat of a response, it appears to be from the rain already is quite significant. It usually takes a year or two after a wet winter to see groundwater levels recover. So I won't say they're recovering, but actually expect them to be lower than they were.
How much groundwater recharge was TID able to do in the area?
Those directed groundwater recharge.
Like the on-farm field
Yeah,
flooding?
I'd ask Wes Miller if he's paying attention. I don't know if he's there. I mean, we're talking maybe hundreds of acre feet, not thousands. So it was pilots. Wes, you're on.
I'm trying. I'm going between two different things here. So I'm sorry, what was the question again?
The question is roughly how much groundwater did we recharge or floodwater did we recharge in those pilot projects you worked on for the district?
81.2 acre feet
81.2.
There you
Yeah.
go.
total. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. That's perfect.
Drop in the bucket.
Up in the bucket,
Yeah.
but pilot showed a proof of concept.
Okay.
So that was the key thing.
Is there more interest now?
There was interest from some of the locals in the area when they saw the water in the canals, but we're still working on what that would look like within our system, because we still have some challenges we have to figure out to do it more at scale, just flipping between two modes, whether it be irrigation or flood control. So there's interest. We just got to figure out how to do more of it. So.
Awesome.
So not to put words in your mouth, Wes, but we get a lot of stormwater in the canals. You're trying to convey it to move it out. So to irrigate with it, you actually got to back it up and irrigate with it. And sometimes it's challenging with the weather conditions to irrigate at the same time you're running a storm system effectively. So these are things we're looking at, but definitely like in the Delhi area. I mean, you told me, Wes, it just that soil just soaked it up like crazy.
Yeah, the Delhi ground was really, it perked super quick, like 14 inches per event, and within 2 hours it was gone. So.
Now that's right on the edge of the Corcoran clay.
Correct.
So
Yeah,
is
that
it
would
possibly
actually be,
groundwater?
from the mapping that I've seen, it would be just to the east of the Corcoran clay, and it
So-
disappeared immediately.
And with the draw going towards the east, is it able to recharge that lower aquifer? Are we thinking?
I would say probably yes, where we were doing it. It was to the,
Okay.
past the cork and clay, yeah,
Awesome. Thank you.
There you go. Thanks, Wes.
no problem.
So yeah, that was groundwater level measurement. So after this summer, the TID board has made what we call replenishment water available to Eastside Water District. So there'll be allowed for some surface water to be used outside TID's district boundaries, east of the district. So encouraging Eastside growers to use surface water that's available instead of pumping. So it's kind of in lieu recharge. And working what other things we can do to make sure our growers maximize the use of surface water this year. Sometimes for them, pumping is a little bit more convenient with their sprinkler system. All right, anything else for the good of the order or doing round table here? Sense not. So with that, we'll move on to our next meeting, which is scheduled for Tuesday, May 9th at 2 p.m. And that will be canceled because I was just looking at like, I'm out of town, so quite a few of us. So we're at the Aqua Spring Conference. So we're moving that to Tuesday, May 2nd. So that will then become a special meeting, right? It's not part of our adopted calendar. So our next meeting will be Tuesday, May 2nd at 2 o'clock in this room. With that, I'll take a motion for adjournment from the West Turlock GSA.
Motion.
Motion by Karen, second by Leandro. Second, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, we are adjourned. Sarah?
Thank you. Second to adjourn.
Move.
Second. Thanks. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned as well.
Right, see you on the 2nd, everyone.